I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
Conflict erupted pretty much immediately as the French re-entered their former colonies in Southeast Asia in 1946, following the uncertainty of World War II. For the next 8 years or so, the subcontinent would be embroiled in an often overlooked colonial civil war between the returning French administration and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh coalition. The Viet Minh, already organized into an effective resistance organization from the wartime years, did not waste any time in fighting their French overlords. These forces had historically been strongest in the north of the country, where Ho Chi Minh's movement had effectively organized frustrated rural peasants and laborers into guerrilla warriors. Urban fighting would spark in the northern capital of Hanoi in December 1946, giving little time for the French to settle themselves in the most important city in northern Vietnam. On the other hand, the French remained dominant in the south of the country, in the colonial organization known as Cochin China. The capital in the south, Saigon, was often termed as the French Pearl of the Orient. For decades, the French administration had established themselves in Saigon, which served as a major trade port for the Indochinese colony and the seat of the colonial government. Saigon was home to the French, and later, the Americans' main indigenous allies in Vietnam. For the French, these were mostly religious minority groups, such as the significant Catholic convert community, which included future president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh, and his powerful family. French allies also included members of the religious sects, as there were many different competing religious groups in Saigon. One of these groups was the syncretic Cao Dai sect, which joined as traditional allies to the French due to their embrace of some Catholic concepts within their faith, alongside Buddhist concepts as well. Although South Vietnam remained primarily inhabited by indigenous Southeast Asian residents, Saigon itself had developed a significant population of expatriates from metropolitan France, who had taken the trek halfway across the world to seek riches and indulge in the colonialist lifestyle. One of the major groups in Saigon were the Corsicans. From the island of Corsica off the south coast of France in the Mediterranean, the Corsicans had a long history as a seafaring people, often working in shipping and in the import-export business. It was unsurprising that many Corsicans had found their way to Saigon and decided to call this city their new home. However, the Corsicans were also famous for another, more nefarious reason: the Corsican Brotherhood. It remains well documented that the Corsican Brotherhood was the prominent criminal organization in the French port city of Marseille, only a few hundred kilometers off the coast of Corsica itself. Marseille acted as France's main colonial port, where a majority of its ships from its overseas possessions in the Far East either arrived or departed through the Suez or around the Cape of Good Hope. The Corsican Brotherhood, a loose organization of criminal enterprises and syndicates, controlled a major share of the illicit narcotics trade between the East and the West. By the mid-1950s, Marseille would be termed Europe's heroin laboratory, as the Corsicans specialized their trade into one massively important skill set: the distillation of raw opium paste into pure, refined heroin powder. Of course, Saigon was quickly teeming with a Corsican underground of its own that worked primarily on the logistics side of the opium trade, either shipping the dope out from Asia, usually from Hong Kong at first, but later from Saigon proper. These would prove to be valuable allies to French intelligence, the Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, or the SDECE, in the brewing First Indochina War. Their role would only grow when the CIA entered South Vietnam in 1954, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay on topic. The French quickly realized that they were in a precarious and rapidly deteriorating position in Southeast Asia. The north of the country remained tenuous for most of the conflict, as the Viet Minh activated across the countryside, building small grassroots organizations across the archipelago of villages amongst the disaffected farmers and peasants. To the ire of the French conventional armed forces, the communist power centers were not in the major cities, which they held a significant grip over, but instead were amongst the peasantry in the rugged valleys and mountains surrounding Hanoi. This reality made any efforts by the French army at directly confronting the Viet Minh, essentially in conventional set-piece battles where they had a clear upper hand, nearly impossible. I'm going to borrow here from Christopher Goscha's book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, which I recommend if you're interested in a sprawling and refreshingly neutral perspective on the First Indochina War. Goscha describes Ho Chi Minh's political program during the war as, quote, Vietnamese war communism. Goscha notes that war communism was by no means a new concept in 1946. First of all, Lenin had developed war communism during the Russian Civil War, and Mao had refined those methods during the Chinese Civil War, which proved to be another instance of the triumph of guerrilla warfare and socialism over conventional warfare tactics. Goscha puts it this way, quote, war and communist statecraft could advance hand in hand, one feeding on the other. He continues, using Maoist methods, Vietnamese communists based in the countryside sought to politicize their majority peasant population in order to control and mobilize this rural force for fighting war, procuring food and labor, and building a communist state, end quote. And maybe most importantly, quote, like the Chinese, the Vietnamese made land reform a central part of their war communism, end quote. Adding to this is Alfred Mccoy in his book, The Politics of Heroin, who describes the First Indochina War as one of contrasts. The French, he claims, quote, viewed the conflict as a tactical exercise whose outcome would be determined according to traditional military doctrine by controlling territory and winning battles, end quote. The Viet Minh, he claims, understood the war as, quote, not a military problem, but a political one. Theirs was a romantic vision of mass uprising, resistance becoming so widespread and so intense that the French would be harassed everywhere, end quote. Mccoy proceeds to share an enlightening quote by Viet Minh commander General Vo Nguyen Giap, who stated the following, quote, political activities were more important than military activities, and fighting less important than propaganda. Armed activity was used to safeguard, consolidate, and develop political bases, end quote. So taking all this into account, it's important to note that the French fundamentally misunderstood the conflict, seeing it as a conventional war fought on conventional terms. This approach would only further damage their reputation amongst the denizens of Southeast Asia, as further military action served to feed into Viet Minh propaganda about Western imperialism and Indo-Chinese independence. Much like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, further French operations in Southeast Asia would further anger the populace, driving more of them into the Viet Minh organization, leading to more unrest, calling for more French military action in response, galvanizing more people towards the Viet Minh, and on and on and on. This fundamental misunderstanding of the terms of the conflict would spell disaster for the French expeditionary forces, as Ho Chi Minh's effective propaganda and political program pushed increasing numbers of Indo-Chinese citizens to his camp. Countries like Vietnam and Laos, that I must note were not at all communist before the war, were hotbeds for political radicalism, and the feeling only grew as the Westerners refused to leave or give up their efforts to return authority. The Viet Minh would only get stronger from here. So, as the French returned to Indochina in 1946, it quickly became clear that things were not the same as when they left. Guerrilla clashes in the countryside began immediately, as the Viet Minh had gained strength throughout the instability of the Second World War. The movement spread throughout the country, as communist cells infiltrated themselves into the French-dominated South. This would be the beginning of what would evolve into the Viet Cong movement, the communist guerrilla forces in the South. Despite the French being firmly in control of Saigon and its surroundings, the countryside was still largely up for grabs, and the Viet Minh capitalized and swayed small villages to take on arms and resist the French occupation. As the First Indochina War began almost immediately after their re-entry, the French also immediately faced the most significant roadblock throughout the entire conflict: budget deficits. We have to remember that France had just finished fighting an all-out war against Germany in Europe, and metropolitan France itself was still recovering from the carnage. In turn, the struggling French populace in Europe were not overly enthusiastic about funding a new conflict, and even less so about sending their fellow countrymen to fight in the Vietnamese countryside. This was further compounded by the immense strength of the French Communist Party in the immediate post-war years. Operation Gladio had not had time to mature yet, and, as we will see later down the line, the CIA would do their part to turn the tables against the French communists in the mid-1950s. However, as it stood in 1947, the communist plurality in France were overtly anti-war, viewing the conflict as a blatant example of bourgeois imperialism. So, the French forces in Indochina were constantly coming up against budgetary and manpower shortfalls. Securing the countryside would be impossible under these circumstances, given the growing strength of the Viet Minh and the stagnating French colonial forces. The conflict that was evolving in Indochina also represented a relatively new type of warfare, known today as guerrilla warfare, or, on the other side, counterinsurgency warfare. Of course, in present times, counterinsurgency-based conflicts are ubiquitous, and remain a major reality within nearly every modern war at some level. However, at the time in the late 1940s, counterinsurgency theory remained ill-defined and theoretically crude. Now, that's not to say that insurgency movements had not existed before Indochina. Quite the opposite, as guerrilla forces had celebrated major successes before the Cold War. Look at, for example, the American, Haitian, and French revolutions, or even all the insurgency movements that bested the British during their imperial period, such as in Afghanistan, South Africa during the Anglo-Zulu War, and Ireland during their War of Independence. But it was only really during the Cold War that theories needed to be developed on how best to defeat insurgency movements. This was due to some major new technological and sociological factors that came with the modern post-war era. Primarily, and maybe most overlooked, is the massive developments in communication technology that had taken place in the interwar and wartime years. Smaller, more portable radio equipment became more widespread during the Cold War, which became a vital tool to insurgents. Allowing a central authority to communicate and send orders to smaller scattered cells across a vast and complex geography gave a massive boost to insurgency movements across the globe. This was paired with the development of new, easy-to-use, and reliable light arms. The Kalashnikov assault rifle, for example, the famous AK-47, which quickly became the universal symbol of insurgencies. The AK was invented in the Soviet Union in 1947, and was produced at a massive scale from 1949 onwards. Of course, the Soviets, who were largely sympathetic to left-wing guerrilla movements across the world, would flood the global south with their newly developed practical weapon that was designed to be so simple that it could be theoretically, or unfortunately sometimes in reality, used by a child. The Viet Minh would adopt the AK-47 as their conventional arm of choice in the 1960s. The Soviets would also eventually develop the next best tool to modern insurgency movements in 1958, with the development of the RPG-7, a weapon that allowed a single insurgent to down a cumbersome, multi-million-dollar enemy tank. These advances in weaponry and communications allowed insurgency movements to swell to unprecedented levels of strength and impact against their opponents, usually Western-backed administrations during the early Cold War, but later any hostile government, be it communist or capitalist. Now, these technological advances would not have made as big of a difference to insurgency movements without the help of powerful benefactors to provide these new arms and equipment to the insurgents. As I previously mentioned, and as would be the case throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union became one of the major sponsors of Third World revolutionary movements across the globe. This was certainly the case in Indochina, where Moscow's direct provision of arms and advisors would help Ho Chi Minh's forces to defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, as we will see in a bit. Throughout the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese would have both China and the Soviet Union as key allies. But in reality, it was really the Soviets that remained the essential partners to the North Vietnamese, as throughout the conflict there, only they had the productive capacity and technological development to provide the state-of-the-art weaponry needed to best the US military, such as artillery and AK-47 assault rifles, as I previously mentioned. With that, Vietnam became essentially the archetypal proxy war, with both the US and the Soviets supporting their respective sides to the end. The Viet Minh relied on Soviet weaponry and advisors, and the South Vietnamese, which were largely a Western creation, relied on US weapons and support. So all this to say that the establishment of two major communist powers in the world during the Cold War, those being China and the Soviet Union, served to further bolster Third World insurgencies. Eventually, the Cold War would largely devolve into a global engagement of insurgency versus insurgency, Western-backed and armed irregulars facing off against communist-backed and armed irregulars. These types of conflicts would arise in Angola, Nicaragua, and Cambodia, for example, but would really first take shape in Vietnam and Laos. Of course, as I previously mentioned, the promise of independence for colonial nations during and after the Second World War had a strong ideological effect on the masses of the Third World. Independence seemed achievable, as Britain began to let go of its colonies, and the United Nations made proclamations of self-determination and autonomy for all. With colonialism in recession and the world settling from a 6-year all-out war, for many, the time was right to demand independence. In the cases where independence was not swift, insurgency movements often had general popular support from a mass base of disaffected and frustrated colonial subjects. This would be the case in both of France's major Cold War battlegrounds, first in Indochina until 1954, and then immediately afterwards in Algeria until the staggeringly late year of 1962. Colonialism became an outdated idea, at least within the uncompromising 18th century model. Insurgencies would ensure the system's downfall. So we have a Viet Minh guerrilla movement gaining massive strength across the countryside, facing off against a conventional French colonial army with little counterinsurgency strategy and gaping funding and manpower gaps. The result was a protracted 8-year conflict, wherein the French won the rare major encounters with the communists, but were continuously on the back foot due to unpredictable guerrilla raids in the countryside. Continuous attrition and steady erosion of morale caused a slowly deteriorating situation, as the North was eventually overrun by the North Vietnamese in the early 1950s. The First Indochina War was in many ways an unnecessary conflict. The French were too slow and too under-resourced to adjust to the new landscape of guerrilla warfare. And when they did finally adapt, right at the end of the conflict, it was too little, too late. But now you may be asking, okay, but what the hell does all of this have to do with Laos? Well, I did mention that the French did finally begin to adapt to the new circumstances of counterinsurgency in Indochina, and that took place largely in nowhere else but Laos. In late 1951, a little under 3 years before the conclusion of the First Indochina War, Major Roger Trinquier, a counterinsurgency expert and future theorist, touched down in Saigon for his 3rd tour of service in the colony. Trinquier was not with the French army this time. He was nominally serving as an intelligence agent under the newly formed Mixed Airborne Commando Group, or MACG for short, essentially a special forces division under French intelligence. Trinquier was entering the war at a time when morale and funding were at an all-time low. It was time to get creative and develop arguably the single most impactful innovation to counterinsurgency work during the beginning of the Cold War, and that was narco-counterinsurgency. Let's get into it. When Trinquier returned to Indochina in 1951, he understood the reality on the ground and that the French were getting humiliated by the Viet Minh guerrillas, especially in the countryside. He also knew that his operation would have to be lean, extremely cheap, as the French government was in no position to commit additional resources to the losing war. Trinquier figured out the solution. What if the war paid for itself, and even more? And what if the war was fought not by the French, but by indigenous allies in Indochina? Well, those indigenous allies would appear not in Vietnam, but in northern Laos. The Hmong people, the main purveyors of the French opium monopoly, returned to focus for the French intelligence officer. It is important to note here that when the French returned to Indochina in 1947, the mood around the world surrounding opium had changed substantially. The legitimate opium trade that had been perpetuated by the colonial monopolies before the war had subsided over the wartime years. Now the trade had largely moved underground to the domain of organized crime. The Hmong had not stopped growing opium, however. They simply sold the product to new clients, specifically the Xuyen River Pirates, an organized crime syndicate prominent in the marshes around Saigon, and the remnants of the Chinese mafia that were slowly being pushed out of mainland China and into Hong Kong and Bangkok after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. So, the Hmong continued to grow their cash crop, but the French were no longer in the picture. Major Trinquier would change that with the help of a fellow French intelligence officer, a Corsican named Antoine Savigny. That operation would be codenamed Operation X. Now, I want to take a moment real quick here to correct a mistake I made in a previous video. In part 3 of this series, I mistakenly called the American narco-smuggling operation in China and Burma right at the end of the Second World War as Operation X, when I now know that it was likely an early iteration of Operation Paper, which we covered in episode 6 of the CIA series. My apologies for the mistake. I try my best to get the facts correct, but sometimes I am misled by my sources. Now, I don't want to use this as an excuse, because this really shouldn't have happened. I should have looked into this more closely, but I do have explanations for it. The source I pulled this from for the video was a book by Paul L. Williams called Operation Gladio, which I've learned recently was quite a rushed process, and it seems like Paul Williams did not fully fact check his sources because throughout the book there are many erroneous statements. So in this book, he erroneously terms the CIA's operation in China at the end of World War II as Operation X, when now I know that this was a French intelligence operation. I will not be using the Paul L. Williams source from now on, and I do not recommend using it for any kind of academic purposes because it is full of factual inaccuracies. So, for the record, Operation X was a French intelligence operation in Laos and North Vietnam. It surely influenced US operations down the line, and all the other details in that video do remain correct. But nonetheless, I just wanted to clear that up. Again, sorry about that. So, returning to the topic on hand, Operation X was masterminded by two key French intelligence officers. Firstly, by Captain Antoine Savani, who Alfred Mccoy calls the, quote, Corsican Machiavelli, and Major Roger Trinquier, who McCoy labels as the, quote, cold-blooded scientific tactician. Here we have right out of the gate the two key areas of expertise necessary to run a successful narco-counterinsurgency program. Firstly, you have Savani, who represented the logistics side of the program, overseeing the shipping of the dope and liaising with criminal enterprises to essentially turn the profit necessary to run the guerrilla armies. Then on the other side, you have the tactical, irregular warfare expert Roger Trinquier, who would take the profits generated from the dope and use them to arm, feed, and pay the Hill Tribe mercenaries. In this vein, Operation X's stated goal was to engage Hill Tribe Hmong mercenaries in northern Laos to act as a second strike force alongside the French in the ongoing counterinsurgency campaign in North Vietnam. The focus was on diverting the enemy away from the French-dominated south and bringing the guerrilla engagements to the enemy in the north. This simple strategic objective would find itself in US plans for the region as well, as bringing the fight to the Viet Minh North continued to prove challenging throughout the engagement, especially in the face of ongoing Viet Cong insurgencies in the south throughout both conflicts. The key to Operation X, however, was the funding, or lack thereof. This is where Antoine Savigny, the Corsican, hatched the major innovation of Operation X. The idea was that by buying the Hmongs raw opium at a competitive rate, of course, and marketing it in the south in Saigon, French intelligence would essentially procure a fighting force of able-bodied men completely paid for by the profits of the illicit trade. Additionally, in activating the Hmong against the Viet Minh, the French would not have to endanger any of their own men, instead using local denizens against each other, solving the manpower concern. The operation began with Savani making an initial contact with the major opium dealers in Saigon, which at the time were the Binh River Pirates. In 1946, as the French re-entered their colony, they began by disbanding the sanctioned opium monopoly and forced the many opium dens of Saigon to shut their doors, following a substantial international pressure to disband the harmful trade across the world. Now, at face value, this policy might have appeared to be a crackdown on Indo-Chinese narcotics production. But in reality, it simply painted the opium industry in the colony with a new coat of paint. See, the opium industry simply shifted fully into the control of Corsican and Vietnamese organized crime. The opium dens, which were mostly owned by the criminal enterprises, were easily renamed to detoxification clinics, and the whole trade continued unperturbed and in the shadows. The French did little to crack down as they were too busy fighting the Viet Minh in the 1940s and 50s. But also, the Binh, who operated the dope-filled detox clinics, began to operate as a quasi-militia force in the region surrounding Saigon. Now, not only had the river pirates become a sort of unofficial paramilitary force fending off Viet Minh guerrillas in the south, but they had also become the major manufacturers and vendors of smokable opium in Saigon, through their 2 major boiling plants and their network of recently renamed detox clinics. So, Captain Savani clearly understood that to crack into the massive profits of the drug trade, a deal had to be struck between the Binh Xuyen and French intelligence. So, the French allied themselves to the Vietnamese pirates, supplying them with an $85,000 a year stipend to secure their loyalty. This alliance with the river bandits, although useful to the French spies at the time, would prove troublesome to the future South Vietnamese government of Nguyen Dinh Diem, as the militarized pirates would challenge his authority almost as soon as he became president. Now, we will see that in the next chapter, but for the time being, in the early 1950s, the Operation X network was ready and the alliances were forged. All that was left was to engage the Hmong in Laos, and Trinquier would be on that task. But before we move on, however, I would be remiss to ignore Savani's Corsican lineage, which also likely ingratiated him with the Corsican mobsters in the Saigon region, working to sell any excess supply to international export, likely for Marseille, as we will explore down the line. Around this same time period, the Corsicans in Saigon were likely also beginning to establish their own small charter airlines, to ship dope from the rural villages in the north to the ports in the south. Although during this period most of the raw opium was transported via MACG planes, the Corsican Airlines would become key partners to the CIA in their South Vietnamese client state in the coming decade, especially in the interwar period between both of the major Indochina wars. Most importantly, the French profits from this new alliance were put into a caisse noire, or a black box in Saigon, an unaccounted safe filled with dirty cash. This was to be used by MACG parachute commandos when they needed to pay off the tribesmen in Laos to join the French operation. Eventually, the Hmong chiefs themselves would ferry down to Saigon when needed and access the black box independently. These funds could have gone to any necessary costs related to the guerrilla operation, be it weapons, radio equipment, construction supplies. It was in reality a completely off-the-books slush fund for French intelligence operations. Of course, as we will see in the rest of this series, the CIA would concoct a far more sophisticated financial system, using shell banks and front companies to undertake the financial aspect of these black ops. Trinquier's caisse noire worked for his purposes, but was surprisingly rudimentary and lacked the flexibility and veil of legitimacy that would be brought on by CIA paymasters and accountants, such as Paul Helliwell and his shadow banking empire that he would help pioneer. Nonetheless, here we get an early look at how illicit narco funds were used to cover the cost of otherwise expensive and unapproved covert operations, from an unmarked safe in Trinquier's office. The most critical part of the plan was the Hmong recruitment, and which was undertaken by Major Trinquier and his MACG commandos. Think of them as the French equivalent to Green Berets. Mccoy describes the recruitment operations in 4 key phases. Stage 1. A group of commandos would fly a small single-engine plane over the hill tribe's territory. If the locals shot at the plane, they knew they were uncooperative, and likely aligned with the Viet Minh. But if the tribe members waved them down, the commandos knew that they had potential allies. Stage 2. Once a cooperative tribe was located, 4 or 5 MACG units would parachute into the target village. There they would recruit about 50 irregulars. These would be the commanders of the new guerrilla band, or as Trinquier referred to them in his interview with Mccoy, the future Maquis. Maquis was a term used by the French and Belgian resistance fighters during the German occupations in the 1940s. Trinquier reappropriated this term to suit his operations, positioning his Hmong commandos as resistant fighters, when in reality, they were to fight their countrymen in the name of the French Empire. Trinquier's commandos would then radio back to headquarters, which was a military installation called Cap Saint-Jacques, just south of Saigon. The 50 or so recruits were then extracted down to Cap Saint-Jacques for comprehensive commando training by French advisors. The original 50 Hmong were then split into 4-man teams and given supplies to effectively form war bands. This whole process, recruitment, training, equipping, and briefing, took about 2.5 months. Stage 3. After the crash course was completed, the new Hmong mercenaries were sent back into the jungle to recruit other tribesmen from neighboring villages into the Maquis structure. They were provided cash, guns, and radios. Each four-man team was then told to recruit an additional 100 men, which was done through propaganda and cash. As the program grew, the French continued to ferry the brightest recruits down to Cap Saint-Jacques for training, returning with planes filled with guns and ammo, which led into the final phase. Stage 4. This was the active phase of the program, where the warbands would consolidate power and root out any Viet Minh influence in their area of operations. Through effective and concurrent recruitment, constant supply, and a consistent stream of cash, the French had assembled a formidable indigenous warband. In total, France controlled 3 major maquis. 2 of the maquis were in the Tonkin region of North Vietnam, one made up of Hmong fighters and one of Thai fighters. And one additional Hmong maquis was found in Laos, which made up the third one. By the end of the Indochina War in 1954, the total number of fighters in the maquis organization was estimated to be in the ballpark of 40,000, the majority being ethnically Hmong, the most important colonial allies in the region. The French-Hmong relationship dated back to their first incursions into Laos in the late 1800s. The Hmong maquis leader in Laos was one Tu Bi Li Phong. Tu Bi had been the first Lao opium monopoly representative during the colonial era, and a prominent warlord in the highlands. Tu Bi had also been the first Hmong citizen to attend a French high school, and was the man of choice for French intelligence when shipping opium. Tu Bi helped coordinate opium deliveries to French dirt airstrips, later known as Lima sites, when the Americans got involved. These opium deliveries were then loaded onto returning DC-3 flights bringing arms and food to the warriors in the jungle. The dope was then brought to Cap Saint-Jacques, where Antoine Savigny, the Corsican mastermind, would coordinate with the Binh Xuyen River pirates and local Corsicans to bring the product to market. The profits were then funneled back into Operation X, either to pay off village leaders in the north or to procure weapons and supplies for the warband. This system was ruthlessly effective and came to no additional cost to the French army. The maquis organization could act both as a strike group, or in other words, an assassination program, and could conversely work as an agile and knowledgeable reconnaissance or scouting unit, using the radio equipment provided to give the French a more accurate assessment of Viet Minh troop movements in the north. These combined capabilities allowed the maquis to support French operations by covering their flanks, such as the successful spring 1953 battle on the Plain of Jars, where Tu Bi Li Phong's Hmong maquis provided necessary backup for the French artillery. This standout military victory allowed the French to establish a base of operations on the Plain of Jars, building a steel mat airstrip and facilities that housed 12,000 troops and small tanks. This base would allow for more efficient logistics, allowing planes to take off for the hills of Laos from a forward operating position in the north. These substantial victories for Trinquier and Savigny's drug-fueled maquis program proved to be some of the only successful French military operations in the war during its final years. The French had been quickly losing control of the north, and Viet Minh propaganda efforts and guerrilla raids in the south were quickly eroding the French hold on the region. The gradual decline of French position in the First Indochina War would culminate in a battle that everyone has probably at least heard about, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, between March and May 1954. I won't go too deep into the details, but essentially in mid-1953, the French Expeditionary Force had successfully pushed northward into the autonomous Thai Federation of Northern Tonkin, right on the border of Laos. There they established a forward base, which they nicknamed the Hedgehog. The plan with this base was to seal off the main border crossing between Vietnam and Laos through the Dien Bien Phu Valley. Built in a river valley surrounded by 2 sheer cliffs, the Hedgehog was a heavily fortified army installation surrounded by World War I style trenches. 16,000 troops were quickly sent to the rugged jungle basin to man the Hedgehog. Interestingly, Alfred Mccoy notes that Civil Air Transport, the CIA's airline and which would become the future Air America, which itself would have a storied history of running dope for the CIA in Laos, was contracted in 1954 by the French to bring troops and supplies to Dien Bien Phu. Now before this, and until 1952, the CIA coordinated civil air transport airlift operations in northern Thailand and Burma under Operation Paper, which we discussed in the previous episode of the History of the CIA series. So, with work winding down in rural Thailand, the CIA simply shifted their efforts to aiding the French in Vietnam and Laos, which, by the way, they had been doing throughout the war. According to an article in Covert Action magazine number 28, by 1954, the US had sent nearly $3.5 billion to the French in aid for the Indochina War. Remember, France joined NATO in 1949, which proved to be a politically risky move for the French government at the time, given the significant power of the Communist Party in France and the broad support they enjoyed in the south of the country. So, for such a staunch ally, and for such a move as joining NATO, Uncle Sam was happy to lend a helping hand to the French in Southeast Asia, with CIA-contracted planes and massive financial aid. Additionally, and maybe most paradoxically, the first American to die in Indochina during the Cold War was not a soldier or an advisor, but actually a CIA-affiliated pilot of a civil air transport C-119 plane. On May 6, 1954, while CAT was providing support to the doomed French retinue at Dien Bien Phu, CAT pilot James McGovern and his crew crashed near Ban Sot, Laos, killing 5 of the 6 men aboard. This event marked the first US casualties of the wars in Indochina, and they were not in Vietnam, but in Laos. And they were not US Army soldiers, but CIA contractors. This was a bad omen of what was to come later in the upcoming decades. Nonetheless, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, as Viet Minh guerrillas hauled Soviet-provided artillery up the treacherous mountains surrounding the Hedgehog in the night. What ensued was a 24-day engagement between Viet Minh guerrillas, sieging and constantly shelling the French soldiers trapped in their heavily defended prison. Dien Bien Phu is consistently cited as a major example of the total abject failure of conventional military thinking in the era of counterinsurgency. What the French brass thought would be an impenetrable fortress ended up as a sitting duck, shelled by the Viet Minh irregulars and surrounded on all sides. However, there's a few aspects of the battle that are often overlooked, which are relevant for our current study. Firstly, although the conventional military tactics employed by the French at Dien Bien Phu were undoubtedly bested by the Viet Minh's logistical feat, and of course the Soviet artillery that was so kindly provided, the French did find success in one area of the battle, and that was in Trinquier's Lao Maquis. In late April, as the battle at Dien Bien Phu was well underway, Trinquier, now commander of the MACG commandos, flew up to their forward base of operations on the Plain of Jars, with a large stock of silver bars in cargo. Once there, he met up with Tu Bi Li Fong and exchanged the silver for 3,000 of Tu Bi's best men. Those troops were put through a rapid-fire 8-day boot camp and then sent to relieve the beleaguered French Hedgehog at Dien Bien Phu. Amongst the commanders of this Hmong crack team was the up-and-coming commander, Vang Pao. Vang Pao had worked with the French as an interpreter before the war, and was now one of Tu Bi Li Fong's top lieutenants. Vang Pao led 850 mountain warriors towards Dien Bien Phu, and successfully cut off some of the Viet Minh's precarious supply lines. Trinquier's Hill Tribe commandos were largely successful in disrupting Viet Minh advances, but were not a decisive factor in the battle, as the Dien Bien Phu base surrendered on May 8th. The Hmong Maquis all returned home to Laos, defeated and exhausted from the harsh jungle warfare. Vang Pao would remember his victories under the French, and so would Trinquier. Vang Pao was only 22 during Dien Bien Phu, but he was already proving to be a priceless asset to foreign governments seeking to exert control over Laos. Vang Pao, as we will see in the next part, would be the CIA's chosen asset in Laos, essentially using his army as their main operators during the secret war. But for now, Vang Pao waited for his new clients to arrive. It wouldn't take long, however. The fate of the war was set in stone on May 8, 1954, when Vietnamese, French, Russian, Chinese, British, and American delegates met in Geneva, Switzerland to devise the peace treaty that would end the First Indochina War. The leader of the American delegation was none other than Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, brother to CIA Director Allen Dulles. Undoubtedly, in hindsight, the CIA was fully apprised of the situation in Southeast Asia, especially since they had an ally in Geneva and paramilitary advisors on the ground at Dien Bien Phu, including those civil air transport planes I talked about. It took until July 20th to finally settle a peace agreement, which included independence for 4 new states in the former French colony. First, there was Cambodia in the southwest, and then Vietnam was split into 2, with a communist North Vietnamese state in the north, obviously, and a capitalist South Vietnamese state. This was split at the 17th parallel. And finally, there was the small mountainous country of Laos in the northwest. Crucially, the agreement called for a near-total French and American military exit from Vietnam, with the exception of a minuscule contingency of military advisors, not to exceed 342 men per power. This was paired with a freeze on any new troop deployments in the subcontinent between the July 20th signing date and the effective date of the troop agreement of August 11th, 1954. The Laos question, however, was handled under an attached agreement, also signed on July 20th, called the Agreement on the Cessation of Hostilities in Laos. Although Laos was given independence as the newly minted Kingdom of Laos under the Geneva Accords, the aforementioned side agreement did allow the French to retain significant influence in the landlocked Keystone State, under the auspices of training the new Royal Lao Army. This side agreement allowed the French to maintain 2 permanent bases in Laos, one in Gino, on the western border with Thailand, crucially an important trade vector to the port in Bangkok in Thailand, and one installation outside of the capital in Viet Nam. The French were allowed to maintain a garrison of 3,500 men to manage these facilities, and an additional 1,500 men for training purposes. It was clear that Western diplomats at Geneva were already preparing for Laos to be a major forward position for their Southeast Asian operations in the coming decade. Despite this small concession at Geneva, the conference in 1954 largely signaled the end of formal French military involvement in Southeast Asia, as the buck was being passed to the United States, who would have their own quagmire in the subcontinent shortly, as we all know. Besides, the French were quickly being pulled into another colonial escapade in Algeria, which would demand their full attention until 1962. As for the US, Geneva was seen as a massive setback in the growing Cold War. According to August 8th and 12th Security Council meetings, the Geneva settlement was viewed as a, quote, disaster that, quote, completed a major forward stride for communism and which may lead to the loss of Southeast Asia, end quote. The Geneva Conference mandated that Laos and Cambodia hold elections in 1954, and that both Vietnams hold separate elections first in 1955, and finally, a unified election in 1956. As we know now, the unification elections in Vietnam were especially contentious, as Western policymakers feared that Ho Chi Minh's party would sweep both countries. The Viet Minh were broadly popular. With such an unstable situation in Southeast Asia, the State Department hoped that the French would remain fully engaged in Saigon to ensure that the Diem regime was able to establish itself fully before the 1956 elections. This would not be the case, and Vietnam was immediately put on the Americans' plate. On August 20th, President Eisenhower approved a National Security Council paper titled, quote, Review of U.S. Policy in the Far East. The 3-tiered program, which is on screen now, asserted that the U.S. would work with France only so far as necessary to build up indigenous forces able to provide internal security, and would provide economic aid directly to Laos, Cambodia, and Diem's regime in the south, and would in all aspects support any political opponent that was anti-communist and pro-U.S. interests. The cast was set. Washington was dipping its feet into Vietnam. In late July 1954, Major Roger Trinquier was packing up his office at the French military installation at Cap Saint-Jacques. He read the news about the Geneva Conference and was ordered to return back to metropolitan France. Although his narco-fueled Operation X was a major success, the war had been lost. His Hmong commandos were effective at fighting the Viet Minh and pulling them off of Dien Bien Phu, but it did not matter in the end. His program was not the deciding factor. Following his time in Indochina, Trinquier would go on to write one of the most important theoretical texts in the modern counterinsurgency field, a textbook titled Modern Warfare. This tome would be consulted by his contemporaries to understand the intricacies of counterinsurgency theory. However, the book that Trinquier would draft made no mention of narco profits, secret bank vaults, or the dope trade. This fact about narco profits he would only reveal later in his life to author Alfred Mccoy, who was writing his book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. In the early 1970s, Trinquier candidly shared his experiences working with the Hmong, shipping dope, and the new methods of funding he developed in Indochina during the latter years of the First Colonial War there. Interestingly, Mccoy included in his book, The Politics of Heroin, a letter sent by Trinquier to his publisher, Harper & Row, following the book's release in 1972. In the letter, Major Trinquier confirms that all the accounts of his activities in the work are correct, except for one point that he wished to emphasize further. I included the full letter on screen if you wish to read it in its entirety. But essentially, he claims that the remaining funds in the black box, or the caisse noire, where all the illegal dope funds went, at the end of the war were returned to French intelligence, and not used to compensate the Hmong fighters that had risked their lives for the French cause. He claims, quote, "I was, however, disappointed. These funds would have been very useful to compensate the men in our services who had dedicated themselves to France, and who we were going to abandon," end quote. Trinquier would later go on to lead counterinsurgency activities in the brutal Algerian War, where his more conventional tactics would be used to varying levels of success. In that conflict, torture would take central stage. Again, another unfortunate innovation in the counterinsurgency field. Either way, Trinquier's impressively transparent 1970 testimony to Alfred Mccoy shines a uniquely bright light into a dark corner of foreign policy that would continue to balloon out of control throughout the Cold War. The groundwork laid by Trinquier and Antoine Savigny in Laos and Saigon would be almost immediately picked up and massively expanded by the CIA, and used to their own devices during their time in Southeast Asia. But returning for a second to Trinquier in late July 1954, just to wrap up for today. As the Major was preparing to leave Vietnam, he was joined in Saigon by his replacement, 2 Americans. They claimed to be a part of a new grouping called MAG, the Military Assistance Advisory Group, set up by the American CIA to support President Diem's defense and counterinsurgency strategy. Although Geneva only allowed the US and France to have a minuscule contingency of ground forces, there were little restrictions on advisors and apparent civilian personnel. This is why MAG was established under the civilian CIA, allowing American advisors to operate undisturbed by pesky international law. The 2 Americans were paying a visit to Trinquier to learn some lessons about his counterinsurgency strategy. The first man, the senior officer out of the 2, was a charismatic Special Forces vet who had just returned from leading a successful counterinsurgency program in the Philippines against the communist Hmong rebellion. This man was the leader of MAG, the one and only Colonel Edward Lansdale. A close personal friend to CIA Director Allen Dulles, he was handpicked to advise President Diem on counterinsurgency matters and to lead the early stages of the war over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Next to Lansdale was his second in command, a short intelligence officer with a Corsican name, who had supported the Corsican mob in the south of France during the waning years of the Second World War. His name was Xuyen. This pair, the decorated psychological warfare officer Lansdale, and his devious mob-associated sidekick, represented a mirror image to their French counterparts, Major Trinquier, the psychological warfare officer, and Captain Savigny, the Corsican. It's fascinating how history always offers these strange parallels. The 2 Americans listened and took notes as Trinquier explained in detail his Operation X plan. Trinquier explained that the infrastructure for the plan was largely untouched and remained ready to go if they wanted to activate it. The name Vang Pao surely came up, the upstart young commando leader who had successfully led his mountain guerrilla forces to delay the disaster at Dien Bien Phu. Lansdale and Canet finished their meeting with Trinquier and cabled Allen Dulles at the CIA. Initially skeptical of the use of narco-profits to fund wars, Lansdale claimed later in life that he signaled his disapproval of this strategy, although I'm not sure if I believe him entirely. Allen Dulles, on the other hand, was particularly impressed by the French major's cunning and the overall potential of such a plan. He likely saw that the French had reached the same conclusion as the CIA themselves did in Burma with Operation Paper. So, as it always happened, it would soon be the CIA creating an Operation X of their own, and Dulles and his successors would find men who had no moral qualms about running this type of operation, as their program would be much larger, much more efficient, and maybe most importantly, much more deadly than the French predecessor. The CIA was entering the heart of darkness, and annihilation was on the horizon. Thank you all for watching part 2 of my Secret War in Laos series, and please, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment down below, letting me know what you thought. It helps a lot with the algorithm. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on March 18, 2024, as a double feature to start Season 2. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video without their generous support. And on screen now are the names of my producer tier patrons. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the thin confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So once again, thank you. If you wish to support my independent documentary filmmaking, please consider checking out my Patreon link below. The 7 remaining videos that will be premiering weekly on this channel for the rest of 2024 over the next couple of months are available there now if you wish to binge them. The second video of Season 3 should also be up next week, which will be the last part of my 2-hour-long documentary covering President George H.W. Bush's early CIA career. This one will cover his work as a CIA business asset in the Caribbean. I hope you check it out. Next week, I will be uploading part 3 of this Secret War in Laos series to YouTube, and this will be my documentary covering the creation of the state of South Vietnam and the legendary Edward Lansdale's impact on counterinsurgency efforts there. This will also be focused on the Asian side of the French Connection. I've seen a lot of you commenting below that you would like some information about the French Connection, and I feel like we often overlook the Asian side, specifically the Southeast Asian side of it. So we're going to look at that and how Laos was a key to global opium supplies starting in the 1950s all the way to the 1990s. And I hope that you will all tune in for that as well. So that's all I've got for today, folks, but thank you so much for watching as always. And remember, please leave a like if you like this video, comment, helps the algorithm a lot. And as always, keep your eyes wide open. Take care.